Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in addition to Senator Ed Markey have released the details of the Green New Deal. Now, this is something that's been talked about quite a bit lately, and everyone claims on the left that they support it, but no one really knew specifically what was in it. And now we're getting a better sense of who really supports it. But nonetheless, let me give you the details of what this Green New Deal includes. One thing I want to make sure you know is that this is a non-binding agreement, but it does set the framework in which our lawmakers can begin writing legislation that goes along with it, which of course would be binding. Now, the deal calls for meeting 100% of the power demand in the United States through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources. That much we knew, but it also includes upgrading all existing buildings in the country for energy efficiency. There's also an emphasis in these details pertaining to the poor and for people who wouldn't be able to, single-handedly make these upgrades or updates to their properties, for instance. And so it takes that into account and would offer assistance for those people. Working with farmers to eliminate pollution and greenhouse gas emissions as much as is technologically feasible. Overhauling transportation systems to reduce emissions, including expanding electric car manufacturing, building charging stations everywhere. And then this is the part that I thought was extremely bold, and I think this is probably the part that will be fought against the hardest. Expanding high-speed rail to a scale where air travel stops becoming necessary. Look, I know that there's gonna be debate about how realistic that is, especially when you consider the corporations that will influence that discussion. But with that said, the idea of never having to fly again is amazing.
Amazing.
Amazing, right.
Maybe we could do a Hyperloop. So here's the situation. Do I support every one of these goals? Kind of. So here's what I mean by that. I love the Green New Deal, and if I could vote for it, I would vote for it. So the only reason I say kind of is, am I positive that in 10 years we're going to have enough high-speed rail to make sure that there's almost no flights left? No, of course I'm not positive about that. Am I positive that we're going to upgrade all existing buildings in the country the next 10 years in our effort to get to carbon neutral? No, of course I'm not positive about that. Do I believe that this is a good starting point for legislation so that when we go to do something that we set a very big goal and we're ambitious? Yes, I believe that is the correct way to pursue legislation. I do not believe in the normal corporate democratic way of, well, let me go 3/4 of the way towards the Republicans and then begin to negotiate.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're negotiating something, and look, I'm not necessarily a good negotiator, but I know that the right way to negotiate is you start off with a super lofty goal that you know is probably not gonna be agreed upon. But you start at such a high place that the hope is you'll eventually get to a realistic place where you can both agree on, right? And so if you want a settlement, for instance, for, I don't know, $10,000, you don't go in saying, I want $10,000. You go in saying you want $100,000, and then at that point, the expectation is so high that the person you're negotiating with will eventually get to a point where you're happy, which is probably $10,000.
But also, the idea of being big is not just to whittle it down. And I don't want people to get the wrong idea of like, hey, we'll immediately compromise on this. No. The idea is to make it so big that it becomes something that the country can unite around. And which, by the way, would create an enormous amount of jobs, and why this is in fact a very popular proposal, including huge percentages of Republicans who agree with it, the Republican voters, of course not the politicians. And if you try to nickel and dime something, sometimes it doesn't get done at all.
Exactly.
Oftentimes it doesn't get done at all. When you go for the gold and you go for it all, maybe you don't get there in 10 years. Maybe the legislation is exactly this, but we don't hit it in 10 years, we hit it in 11 years.
Yep.
I'll take it, that would be fantastic. Or we don't hit 100% of it in 10 years, but we hit 82% of it in 10 years. Well, that would be infinitely better than what we're trying for today.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe, look, my analogy wasn't perfect because I'm not saying like, oh, start with this and then whittle it down to something tiny. No, I'm saying start with something incredibly bold and fight for something bold, and then maybe there are small terms, conditions that can be negotiated. You don't get exactly what you want, but you're close to what you want. And I really do think that this is possible, especially when you consider where the electorate is on this issue, including Republicans. An increasing number of Republican voters are starting to see greenhouse gas emissions as a serious problem. They're starting to actually feel the ramifications of climate change. And so this is no longer simply a progressive issue. Americans are becoming more and more united in understanding the importance of doing something about this. But go ahead.
Can I give you those numbers real quick? They polled this and they polled at 81%. Wow. So, when we talk about realistic, there's the policy implementation of it and then there's the politics of it. If you can't get something that's 81% popularity passed, then you can't get anything passed. I mean, Nancy Pelosi claims to be a master legislator. She's against this, but if she was a real progressive and wanted this to happen, pretty sure a master legislator should be able to get a proposal passed that 81% of Americans agree with. In fact, 64% of Republicans agree with it, and 57% of conservative Republicans agree with it. If you can't get that passed, you're not a master legislator, you're terrible at legislating. Now, I know what the excuse that the corporate Democrats will come in with even before the Republicans. They'll say, oh yeah, but those numbers will be whittled down when people find out how expensive it is, or how we're gonna have to raise some taxes, or how hard it is. In other words, I will help whittle down those numbers along with Republicans. I will actually attack this plan before the Republicans even get a chance. And I will help to bring those numbers down instead of up. That's what the corporate Democrats tell you.
So let's hear from AOC. She did a press conference where she talks about this deal in a little more, elaborated on it a little more. Take a look.
There is no justice and there is no combating climate change without addressing what has happened to indigenous communities. That means that there is no fixing our economy without addressing the racial wealth gap. That means that we are not going to transition to renewable energies without also transitioning frontline communities and coal communities into economic opportunity as well. That is what this is about. It is comprehensive, it is thoughtful, it is compassionate, and it is extremely economically strategic as well. Today is also the day that we choose to assert ourselves as a global leader in transitioning to 100% renewable energy and charting that path.
I want to be clear about one of the reasons she's saying that, because it's not like the right wing's gonna react with like, oh, you just want to protect minorities. No, she's looking to protect the planet, everybody on the planet. But the critique that a lot of times the corporate Democrats and Republicans use is, well, if in the midst of this, sometimes if gas prices go up, for example, or your electricity bill goes up, for example, that'll hurt minority communities even more. Do they really care about those communities? No, they just want to protect the oil companies, right? So what they built into the legislation was, and it's not specific to minorities, specific to lower income and middle class Americans, financial protections built in so that if your energy costs do go up, they compensate for that, okay? And now, of course, that makes the corporate Democrats and Republicans hate it even more, because that might mean raising taxes on the rich a little bit more. And they're like, what are you doing? No, we were just kidding about protecting minorities and lower income people. Don't do that, because that would raise tax on my donors. So Washington, of course, can't stand this, even though the rest of the country loves it, which is a sentence often spoken.
And she didn't only talk about minorities here. She specifically addressed communities that rely on the income they make through fossil fuels, right? So the miners, the people who work for oil refineries, those are the individuals who have legitimate concerns about what happens to them and their economic future if we move toward this type of policy. And I love that she addresses that head on, and she knows that it's an issue. She knows that it's gonna be used and exploited as an attack against this policy, and she's getting out in front of it. And she's not coming at it from solely a political strategy perspective. She's coming at it from a very real, genuine concern, and I think that really shows.
So last couple of things here. I want to congratulate Senator Ed Markey, who also signed on to this in the Senate. So there are some real progressive senators, and that is wonderful to see. And I've given Ed Markey credit a couple of times before, one of the few strong progressives there, and you should note that. And then it's just good to have like a few people on our side in Washington. Look at how much of a difference Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is making. Was anybody talking about solving climate change within 10 years before her? Remember, scientists say we got to solve it within 12 years. So that's an actual real timeline. And so she's the only one actually going for it to make sure that we don't melt the planet. By the way, just like my wife said this the other day, the Earth is not what we have to protect. The Earth doesn't care. It'll keep going round and around the sun. Okay, it'll just shrug us off, and it'll be done with us, and it'll be fine. A meteor hit the Earth. The dinosaurs got wiped out. The Earth was fine. Okay, the thing we got to worry about is us. We're gonna wipe ourselves off the planet. Okay, so anyway, but when you go big, I want to point out that it has other extra advantages. So right now, if you just try to chip away at this thing, you're not gonna have enough charging stations for the electric cars throughout the country. But if you go big and you do charging stations all across the country, well, that makes electric cars way more possible to take over and not to use the old cars anymore. So sometimes half a loaf, or as Democrats often fight for 5% of a loaf, but a small portion of a loaf sometimes is no loaf at all. Because you're never gonna get to a transition of electric cars if you only have a couple of charging stations. So that's why it's important to go for the whole thing. The corporate Democratic idea is usually, oh, Kennedy wants to go to the moon. That's outrageous, we can never get to the moon. How about we go to Canada instead? Yeah, that doesn't really get the job done. Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.